My son's prom date's father arrived at 2 a.m. Your son drugged my daughter and left her in a parking lot tonight. I stared at the man standing on my porch in the darkness, his face twisted with rage, and something else I couldn't identify. Behind him in his truck, I could see a girl slumped in the passenger seat, her prom dress torn at the shoulder, mascara streaking down her pale face. My stomach dropped as I recognized her. Natasha, the girl my son Cooper had been talking about for weeks leading up to tonight. The doorbell had woken me from the first decent sleep I'd had in months, and now I stood in my pajamas trying to process words that didn't make sense. Cooper drugged someone? My 17-year-old son who still asked permission before eating the last cookie? The man stepped closer, and I could smell alcohol on his breath mixed with something sharper. Fear, maybe, or adrenaline. His name was Richard Moss, and I'd met him briefly when Cooper picked up Natasha for prom 6 hours ago. He'd seemed friendly then, shaking my hand firmly, taking photos of the kids with their matching corsage and boutonniere. Now his eyes were wild, and his fists were clenched at his sides. He said Natasha had called him from a gas station parking lot at midnight, barely able to form words, saying Cooper had put something in her drink at the after-prom party. Richard had driven there immediately and found his daughter stumbling around the parking lot alone, her phone clutched in one shaking hand, unable to remember how she'd gotten there or where Cooper had gone. She'd been sick in his truck on the way home, he said, and kept drifting in and out of consciousness. I tried to speak, but my mouth was too dry. I managed to ask where Cooper was now, and Richard said he had no idea, that his only concern was getting Natasha home safe and making sure I understood what my son had done before he called the police. The word police made my hands start trembling. I asked if he'd taken Natasha to the hospital, and his face darkened. He said she refused to go, that she was terrified and humiliated and just wanted to be in her own bed. I told him she needed medical attention immediately if she'd been drugged, that we needed to know what was in her system, that evidence needed to be collected. Richard's expression shifted to something like disgust. He said I was already making excuses, already trying to cover for my son instead of taking responsibility for raising someone capable of this. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I stepped back and asked if I could speak to Natasha directly, if I could hear what happened from her. Richard blocked my path toward his truck and said absolutely not, that I wasn't going anywhere near his daughter ever again. He said he'd given me the courtesy of telling me in person before involving the police, but that courtesy was over. He pulled out his phone, and I watched him dial while my brain scrambled to catch up with everything happening. I asked him to wait, please just wait 1 minute while I tried to reach Cooper and figure out what was going on. Richard laughed bitterly and said there was nothing to figure out, that the facts were simple. My son had drugged his daughter and abandoned her. Everything else was just details. I ran inside to grab my phone from the kitchen counter, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it twice. Cooper's location was still shared with me through the family tracking app we'd set up when he first started driving. The little dot showing his phone's location sat unmoving at an address I didn't recognize, about 15 minutes from our house. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. Tried texting with no response. I went back to the front door where Richard was still standing, now speaking to someone on his phone in a low, urgent voice. I told him I had Cooper's location and could go get him right now, that we could all sit down together and sort this out. Richard ended his call and stared at me with contempt. He said the police were on their way to my house, and I should stay put unless I wanted to be charged with interfering in an investigation. My neighbor's porch light clicked on across the street. I could see her silhouette in the window watching. Richard walked back to his truck and got in, starting the engine but not leaving, clearly waiting for the police to arrive. I stood in my doorway feeling split into pieces. Part of me wanted to drive to wherever Cooper was immediately and demand answers. Part of me wanted to check on Natasha, to see for myself what condition she was in. Part of me wanted to lock my door and pretend this was all a nightmare I'd wake up from. Instead, I called my brother Garrett, who answered on the 5th ring, sounding groggy and confused. I explained the situation in broken sentences, and he said he'd be there in 20 minutes. The police arrived before Garrett did. 2 officers, one older with gray hair and a weathered face, one younger who looked barely older than Cooper. They spoke to Richard first, standing by his truck for several minutes while I watched from my porch. The younger officer went to the passenger side, and I saw him lean down to speak to Natasha through the window. She didn't get out. After what felt like an hour but was probably 10 minutes, both officers walked toward my house. The older one introduced himself as Officer Kenyon and asked if my son was home. I said no and showed him the location on my phone. Kenyon asked if I'd spoken to Cooper since the prom, and I explained about the calls and texts going unanswered. He asked what time Cooper had left for prom, and I told him 5 in the afternoon, that he'd picked up Natasha at her house around 5:30. Kenyon asked if Cooper had access to any drugs or medications in our home. The question made me feel sick. I said no, absolutely not, that we didn't keep anything stronger than ibuprofen in the medicine cabinet. He asked if Cooper had any history of behavioral problems, aggression, drug use, anything that might be relevant. I said no to everything, my voice getting higher and tighter with each question. Cooper was a good kid, honor roll student, varsity baseball. He volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. He was planning to study engineering at State next year. He wouldn't do what Richard was accusing him of. Kenyon's expression stayed neutral, but I could see doubt in his eyes. He said he needed to go to the location where Cooper's phone was pinging and asked if I wanted to accompany them or wait at home. I said I was coming with them. Garrett arrived as I was getting into my car to follow the police cruiser. He parked blocking Richard's truck in and jogged over to me, his hair sticking up on one side from sleep. I explained where we were going, and he got in my passenger seat without argument. We followed the police through empty streets, every traffic light seeming to take forever. Garrett asked questions I didn't have answers to. What had Cooper said about tonight's plans? Had I met any of his friends? Did I know if he'd been drinking? I told him Cooper had said they were going to dinner before prom, then the dance, then an after-party at someone named Ethan's house, whose parents were supposedly going to be home. I'd given Cooper a standard speech about making good choices, and he'd rolled his eyes and promised to be home by 2 in the morning. The address led us to a neighborhood I'd never been to, newer construction with identical houses packed close together. The police cruiser pulled up in front of a house with all the lights off except for one upstairs window. Several cars were parked along the street and in the driveway, including Cooper's beat-up sedan sitting crooked at the curb. I was out of my car before Garrett could stop me, running toward Cooper's car and looking through the windows. Empty. No sign of him. Kenyon caught up to me and said to wait while they checked the house. I watched the officers walk up to the front door and ring the bell repeatedly. Lights clicked on inside. A man in a bathrobe answered, looking confused and annoyed. I couldn't hear the conversation from where I stood, but I saw the man's expression change from irritation to alarm. He disappeared inside and came back a minute later with a teenage boy in pajamas rubbing his eyes. The boy was Ethan, I learned later. He stood on his porch talking to the officers while his dad hovered behind him, looking increasingly distressed. After several minutes, Kenyon came back to where Garrett and I waited by my car. He said Ethan confirmed there had been an after-prom party at his house earlier that evening with about 20 kids. His parents had been home the whole time, no alcohol or drugs that they'd seen. Cooper and Natasha had been there until around 11 when they'd left together. Ethan said they'd seemed fine, maybe a little drunk, but nothing concerning. He didn't know where they'd gone after leaving his house. I asked if Cooper had mentioned anything about going somewhere else, and Kenyon said no one at the party knew anything helpful. I called Cooper's phone again. Still voicemail. I tried his best friend Lucas, who answered sounding panicked, saying he'd heard something happened with Natasha and what was going on. I asked if he knew where Cooper might be, and Lucas said he had no idea, that Cooper had been acting normal all night at the party. I asked what normal meant, and Lucas hesitated before saying Cooper had been drinking. Yeah, but not a crazy amount. Just beer. Everyone was drinking beer. Ethan's parents hadn't been paying close attention. I felt my stomach clench tighter. The officers were walking back toward their cruiser, and Kenyon told me they were going to do a wider search for Cooper, checking nearby locations. He gave me a card with his number and said to call immediately if Cooper contacted me. He also said I should expect a detective to reach out tomorrow to ask more detailed questions. Garrett and I sat in my car after the police left, both of us staring at Cooper's empty sedan. Garrett suggested we search the neighborhood on foot in case Cooper was nearby, maybe passed out somewhere. We spent 30 minutes walking up and down streets, checking behind houses and in parks, calling Cooper's name. Nothing. The sky was starting to lighten when we gave up, and I drove home with Garrett following behind me. My house felt wrong when we walked inside, too quiet and too normal for everything that was happening. I tried Cooper's phone every 10 minutes with the same result. Garrett made coffee neither of us drank, and we sat at my kitchen table in silence. Around 6 in the morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered immediately and heard Cooper's voice, thick and slurred and scared. Dad? I asked where he was, and he said he didn't know, that he'd woken up in someone's backyard, and his phone was almost dead. He sounded confused, and kept repeating that he couldn't remember what happened. I told him to stay exactly where he was, and describe what he could see. He said there were houses, a trampoline in the yard next door, a street sign he could barely read that looked like Oakmont or Oakmore. Garrett was already on his phone pulling up maps. We found Oakmont Drive about a mile from Ethan's house, and I told Cooper we were coming to get him right now. His phone died before he could respond. We found him sitting on a curb 3 blocks down Oakmont, still in his rumpled tuxedo with his bow tie hanging loose around his neck. He looked up when I pulled over, and I barely recognized him. His eyes were bloodshot and unfocused, his face pale and drawn. He tried to stand and stumbled, and Garrett had to catch him before he fell. We got him into my back seat, and he immediately leaned his head against the window and closed his eyes. I asked him what happened with Natasha, and he said he didn't know, he couldn't remember. I asked what the last thing he remembered was, and he said being at the party, talking to people, then nothing. Just blank space until waking up in that yard. I drove home trying to decide whether to take him to the hospital or the police station or just home. Garrett said hospital first, that we needed to get blood work done if Cooper was telling the truth about not remembering. Cooper mumbled from the back seat that he felt sick, and Garrett barely got a plastic bag under his face before he threw up. At the hospital, I explained to the intake nurse that my son might have been drugged and needed to be tested. She took Cooper back immediately while Garrett and I filled out paperwork with shaking hands. 2 hours later, a doctor came out and said they'd drawn blood and run a preliminary toxicology screen. Cooper had a blood alcohol level of 0.12, high but not dangerously so. They'd also found traces of benzodiazepines in his system, specifically Rohypnol. The word hung in the air between us. The doctor explained that Rohypnol was commonly known as a date rape drug, that it caused memory loss and impairment, that finding it in Cooper's system suggested someone had given it to him without his knowledge. I asked how it could have gotten into his system, and the doctor said through a drink most likely, that the drug dissolved easily and was hard to detect. She said Cooper was lucky his blood alcohol wasn't higher because the combination of alcohol and Rohypnol could be fatal. She also said we needed to report this to the police immediately because this was a crime. I sat in a plastic waiting room chair trying to process this new information. Someone had drugged my son. Cooper was a victim here, not a perpetrator. But then where was Natasha, and what had happened to her? Officer Kenyon arrived at the hospital within 30 minutes of my call. He took a statement from Cooper, who was more coherent now, but still couldn't remember anything after about 10 in the evening. Cooper said he remembered getting a drink at the party, maybe 2 drinks, talking to Natasha and some friends, feeling dizzy and weird, then nothing until waking up in that yard. He said the last clear memory he had of Natasha was her standing near the kitchen at Ethan's house talking to some girls. Kenyon asked if Cooper had any idea who might have drugged him, and Cooper shook his head, looking miserable and scared. Kenyon said they'd need to question everyone who was at that party and get a clearer timeline of events. I called Richard Moss while Kenyon was still taking notes. He answered on the first ring, and his voice was cold when he said my name. I told him Cooper had been drugged too, that he had Rohypnol in his system, that someone at that party had targeted both kids. Richard was silent for a long moment before saying that didn't change what happened to Natasha. I said I understood that, but we needed to figure out who did this to them. Richard said the police could handle that and hung up. I stared at my phone feeling helpless. Somewhere in this mess was a person who'd drugged 2 teenagers at a party. We needed to find them before they hurt someone else. The detective who'd been assigned to the case called me that afternoon. Her name was Simmons, and her voice was brisk and professional. She said she'd spoken to Richard Moss and to Natasha, who'd been taken to the hospital that morning for a rape kit and blood work. The words rape kit made my knees weak. Simmons said Natasha's blood also showed Rohypnol and alcohol. She said the timeline was still unclear, but they were treating this as a potential sexual assault case. She needed to interview Cooper again, this time at the station with a parent present. We scheduled it for the next morning. I spent the rest of that day trying to piece together what had happened through phone calls with other parents whose kids had been at the party. Most of them were defensive, insisting their children hadn't seen anything wrong. A few were more forthcoming. One mother said her son mentioned that Cooper had seemed really out of it toward the end of the party, stumbling and slurring his words more than made sense for the amount he'd drunk. Another parent said their daughter had seen Natasha arguing with someone outside around 10:30, but couldn't remember who. Slowly, a picture started forming. Both Cooper and Natasha had been drugged sometime between 9 and 10. They'd left the party together around 11. Sometime after that, they'd been separated, and both ended up abandoned in different locations. The question was, what had happened in that gap, and who was responsible? At the police station the next morning, Detective Simmons was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s with dark hair pulled back tight. She set up a recording device and explained that this interview was voluntary, but recommended. Cooper sat next to me looking exhausted despite sleeping for 12 hours. Simmons walked through the timeline methodically, asking about every detail Cooper could remember. He described arriving at Ethan's house around 11:15, everything seeming normal, lots of kids there celebrating. He remembered drinking beer from a keg in the garage. He remembered talking to Natasha, to Lucas, to other friends. He remembered feeling weird around 9:30, dizzy and disconnected. He remembered sitting on a couch and Natasha sitting next to him, then nothing, until waking up in that yard. Simmons asked if Cooper remembered leaving Ethan's house with Natasha. He said no. She asked if he remembered getting in his car. No. She asked if he had any memory of the gas station parking lot where Natasha had been found. No. She asked if he'd had any sexual contact with Natasha that night. Cooper's face went red and he said absolutely not, that they'd barely even kissed before. Simmons made notes without expression. She said they'd pulled security footage from the gas station and from several businesses near Ethan's house. She'd have more questions once they reviewed all of it. She also said they'd impounded Cooper's car to process it for evidence. I asked what kind of evidence, and she said anything that might indicate what happened inside the vehicle. Blood, DNA, fingerprints. The implications made me feel sick. 3 days later, Simmons called with an update that changed everything. The gas station security footage showed Cooper's car pulling into the parking lot at 11:30 with someone else driving. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to show 2 people in the front seat, neither of them Cooper or Natasha. The car had parked in a dark corner of the lot, and the driver had gotten out, walked to the passenger side, and pulled someone out who could barely stand. That person was Natasha, based on her distinctive prom dress. The driver had propped her against a dumpster, gotten back in Cooper's car, and driven away. The whole thing took less than 2 minutes. Simmons said they were working on identifying the driver, but the footage quality made it difficult. What they could determine was that the person was male, average height, wearing dark clothing. She said this evidence cleared Cooper of the accusation that he'd abandoned Natasha, but it raised new questions about where Cooper was during this time and who had taken his car. I asked about the footage from other locations, and Simmons said they'd found Cooper's car on several traffic cameras heading away from the gas station toward the neighborhood where Cooper was eventually found. The car had parked on a side street, and the same person who'd driven it got out and walked away. The timestamp suggested Cooper had been dumped shortly before Natasha. The realization hit me hard. Someone had drugged both kids, taken Cooper's car keys, driven them to separate locations, and abandoned them both. This wasn't a case of Cooper attacking Natasha. This was someone attacking both of them. I asked Simmons if they had any suspects, and she said they were interviewing everyone who'd been at the party. She also said they'd found something interesting in Cooper's car during processing, a phone that wasn't Cooper's or Natasha's, wedged between the driver's seat and center console. The phone was locked, but they were working on accessing it. She said once they got into that phone, they'd likely have their answer about who did this. The phone belonged to a kid named Trevor Harding. I'd never heard the name before, but when Simmons showed me his photo from the school yearbook, I recognized him vaguely as someone who might have been at the prom. He was a senior like Cooper, played football, had gotten into some trouble the previous year for fighting. Simmons said Trevor's parents claimed he'd been home by midnight that night, but his phone's location data told a different story. The phone had been at Ethan's party, then moving with Cooper's car through all the locations they'd tracked, then stationary at Trevor's house after 2 in the morning. When confronted with this evidence, Trevor had lawyered up immediately. The next week crawled by with painful slowness. Cooper was suspended from school pending the investigation, which meant he sat at home spiraling into depression and guilt, despite being a victim himself. The school board had decided that until they understood what happened, both Cooper and Trevor would be kept off campus. Natasha was also out, though I didn't know if that was her choice or the school's decision. I drove past her house twice, wanting to check on her, but couldn't bring myself to knock on the door. Richard Moss had made it clear I wasn't welcome. Cooper spent his days sleeping and playing video games and refusing to talk about what happened. I made appointments with a therapist who specialized in trauma, but Cooper insisted he was fine, that he just wanted everyone to leave him alone. Simmons called on a Thursday morning with news that made everything make terrible sense. They'd accessed Trevor's phone and found dozens of photos and videos, including footage from prom night. Trevor had recorded himself at the party, joking around with friends, and in one video clip, he'd filmed himself dumping a crushed pill into a red plastic cup while laughing. The timestamp was 9:20, right when Cooper said he'd started feeling weird. There was more. Trevor's text messages showed he'd been planning this for weeks, coordinating with someone else whose identity they were still tracking down. The messages referenced teaching Cooper a lesson, making him look bad, ruining his perfect reputation. Apparently, Trevor had been angry about Cooper making varsity baseball, while Trevor had been cut from the team. The whole thing was revenge over high school sports, but the situation was more complicated than simple revenge. The forensics report from Cooper's car had come back, showing evidence that Natasha had been sexually assaulted in the back seat. DNA evidence confirmed Trevor as the perpetrator. Simmons explained that Trevor had drugged both kids, taken Cooper's car keys, driven them somewhere isolated, assaulted Natasha while Cooper was unconscious in the front seat, then dumped them both separately to make it look like Cooper was responsible. It was calculated and planned and sickening. Trevor had tried to destroy Cooper's life and had traumatized Natasha in the process. He was being charged with 2 counts of administering a controlled substance, kidnapping, sexual assault, and evidence tampering. I sat in my kitchen after that phone call and cried for the first time through this whole nightmare. Cried for Cooper, who'd been violated and falsely accused. Cried for Natasha, who'd been assaulted and left in a parking lot. Cried for how close Trevor had come to succeeding in his plan. If Cooper's car hadn't been on those traffic cameras, if Trevor's phone hadn't been found, Cooper might have been charged with crimes he didn't commit. The thought made me physically ill. I called Garrett and told him everything, and he drove over immediately, finding me still sitting at the kitchen table unable to move. He made me eat something and drink water, and reminded me that the truth had come out, that Cooper was safe, that Trevor was going to face consequences. Richard Moss called me that evening, his voice completely different from the rage-filled tone at my door that night. He apologized, said he'd been wrong to accuse Cooper, that he'd been terrified and furious, and had jumped to conclusions. He said Natasha wanted to talk to Cooper when they were both ready, that she felt terrible about what he'd gone through because of her. I told him Cooper wasn't ready yet, that he was still processing everything. Richard said he understood, and that when the time came, he hoped the kids could help each other heal. I said I hoped so too. We hung up with a tentative peace between us. Both of us fathers whose children had been hurt by someone we'd never suspected was dangerous. Cooper's suspension was lifted the following week after the school board reviewed all the evidence. He went back to campus looking thin and tired, wearing his baseball jacket like armor. He told me later that people stared at him in the hallways, that everyone knew what had happened even though the details were supposed to be confidential. He said some kids avoided him and others went out of their way to be supportive. Lucas and the baseball team had made him a welcome back poster that was hanging in the locker room. His coach had called him personally to say his spot on the team was secure and that they'd have his back. Those small kindnesses seemed to help more than anything I could say or do. Trevor's trial was set for 6 months later. The prosecutor said the evidence was overwhelming, and they expected a guilty verdict on all counts. Trevor's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the DA refused, saying this case was too serious for leniency. In the meantime, Trevor was released on bail with an ankle monitor and restraining orders keeping him away from both Cooper and Natasha. The school had expelled him, so at least Cooper didn't have to see him in the halls, but knowing Trevor was out there, free to move around town, made both Cooper and Natasha feel unsafe. Simmons assured us that violations of the restraining order would result in immediate arrest, but that didn't ease the anxiety much. Cooper started seeing the therapist regularly after the first month. He was diagnosed with PTSD from the assault and the false accusation, both forms of violation that his brain struggled to process. The therapist worked with him on coping mechanisms for the nightmares and panic attacks that had started after he went back to school. Some days were better than others. Some days Cooper seemed almost like himself, joking around and making plans for college. Other days he barely got out of bed, the weight of everything too heavy to carry. I learned to read the signs and give him space when he needed it, while also making sure he knew I was there whenever he wanted to talk. Natasha reached out to Cooper 3 months after prom night. She sent a letter through her parents rather than contacting him directly, respecting the boundaries everyone had established. The letter was simple and heartbreaking. She apologized for anything her initial accusation had put him through, explained that she'd been terrified and disoriented and had believed Trevor's lies about what happened. She said therapy was helping her work through the trauma, but she still had hard days. She said she hoped Cooper was healing too and that maybe someday they could talk in person. Cooper read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and putting it in his desk drawer. He said he wasn't angry at Natasha, that she'd been manipulated just like he had. He said he might write back eventually but wasn't ready yet. The accomplice in Trevor's plan turned out to be another football player named Derek, who'd helped Trevor get the Rohypnol and had kept watch during the assault. Derek had felt guilty afterward and had been the one to place an anonymous tip that led police to review the traffic camera footage more carefully. He took a plea deal in exchange for testifying against Trevor, getting a reduced sentence of probation and community service. Some people thought he got off too easy for his role. Others thought his cooperation deserved leniency. I didn't know what to think, except that he'd helped stop Trevor from getting away with it, and that counted for something. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Cooper had to testify about his memory loss and the aftermath of being drugged. Natasha had to testify about the assault itself, describing what Trevor had done while Cooper was unconscious a few feet away. It was brutal for both of them. I sat in the courtroom every day watching the jury's faces as they heard the evidence. The videos from Trevor's phone showing him drugging the drinks, the traffic camera footage showing him driving Cooper's car, the DNA evidence from the assault, the text messages planning the whole thing. Trevor sat at the defense table looking defiant, never showing remorse, even as witness after witness described what he'd done. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Trevor showed no emotion when the verdicts were read. His mother sobbed in the gallery. His father sat stone-faced. At sentencing 2 months later, the judge gave Trevor 15 years in prison with a minimum of 10 before parole eligibility. She said his actions were premeditated and cruel, that he'd shown no remorse, that he'd tried to destroy multiple lives to settle a petty grudge. She said the community needed to be protected from him. Trevor was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief exactly, but something close to it. Justice had been done, even if it couldn't undo the harm. Cooper graduated with his class that spring. He wore his cap and gown and walked across the stage to receive his diploma, and I clapped until my hands hurt. He'd survived something that could have destroyed him, and had come out the other side still himself, still kind, still hopeful about the future. He was heading to state in the fall like he'd planned, studying engineering, starting fresh somewhere new. Natasha was going to a different school in a different state, also starting fresh. They'd never reconnected in person, but Cooper said he'd heard she was doing better, that she'd found a good therapist and a supportive group of friends. He seemed genuinely happy for her. No bitterness or resentment about how everything had started with accusations against him. The night before Cooper left for college, we sat on the back porch like we used to do before everything happened. He thanked me for believing him even when the evidence looked bad, for fighting to find the truth, for being there through all of it. I told him I'd always believe him, always fight for him, that being his father was the greatest privilege of my life. He was quiet for a while, and then said something that stayed with me. He said he'd learned that people were capable of terrible things over the smallest reasons, but also capable of incredible strength when it mattered most. He said he didn't want to live his life afraid or angry. He wanted to live it fully, help others where he could, and trust that most people were good, even when some weren't. 2 years later, Cooper called to say he'd been accepted into a program training advocates for assault survivors, and I knew he'd found his purpose in the wreckage Trevor had tried to make of his life.